Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 13th of July, and you are watching episode 56 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, When is Weather Climate, is my guest, Dr. Bill Johnson. Bill graduated from the University of New England in 1971 with a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. He completed his Master of Science at the Macquarie University in 1985 and completed his PhD at the University of Western Sydney in 2003. Bill worked for the New South Wales Department of Natural Resources for more than 30 years across numerous regional locations. As a senior research scientist, his scope of work included agronomy, catchment hydrology, ecology, and soil science. Throughout his career, he developed an enduring interest in Australia's contemporary and historic climate records. Today, together with a colleague, he runs the science-based website, BombWatch. Bill is greatly concerned how climate science is being weaponised by the government, organisations and people that should be impartial and the public can trust to be objective in their evaluation of all available data. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
If we could just start, can you give us a bit of your own personal background, where you grew up, maybe some of the mischief you got up to, and then how you ventured out onto this course in basically the environment and ecological science?
Oh, not much mischief, Bill.
What? Nothing you were caught doing?
Nothing
Is that it?
Doing. Well, I went to James Rees Agricultural High School in Sydney, and then I went to Armidale and Uni, and then I got a job with the Soil Conservation Service, which became Natural Resources eventually. And they started off at Glen Innes, and then they sent me to Wagga Wagga Wagga, and I was there until 2000. So that was from about 1971 to 2000. And we were a small group at Wagga, just 3 or 4 of us, and we shared the job of doing the weather. We had a weather station, and so every morning at 9 o'clock we'd take turns in going up there and doing the weather routine. And I could probably do it today if I needed to. It's just a very standard sort of thing you do. You do it in all weathers. You get to know what the instruments are like, and so that's how I developed quite an interest in weather stations, weather data. Analysing weather data, looking at problems in weather data, which brings us, I guess, to where we are now, which brings us basically to BombWatch. BombWatch, we started BombWatch because I found it very hard to get material published. So I have a publication record as my role in natural resources and in agronomy and soils and some catchment work. I ended up specialising in management of native grasslands, and I ran a project over 7 years across 3 states, looking at issues to do with grassland management and trying to improve productivity while not damaging the environment. So I retired in 2016. But from around about 2000, my wife and I ran a small cattle enterprise on the south coast at Bemboka near Bega, and we went through the drought, which really knocked everybody about, and we decided it was time to get out of there and permanently retire.
I suppose, like everything, it's a matter of timing when you go into things. Like when I decided to stop work, it was just before the GFC and you could get good interest rates and all that sort of thing. And then you retire, and then all of a sudden cash rates are worth nothing and things dissolve. So it's probably a matter of luck in regards to when you start an enterprise, especially where you're a bit captive by the weather environment and the general surroundings, that if you happen to pick the right time, you go through a boom and can sell it at a high price. But unfortunately, someone always comes along and buys it sort of just as it's coming off the boom and going into a bit of a dip sort of thing. So it's like everything in it. It's a matter of timing and luck to a fair degree in these enterprises.
And a fair bit of knowledge and knowing what your risks are and things like that. And grazing on the south coast. The south coast of New South Wales is actually a pretty peculiar sort of environment. It's a summer rainfall environment. You wouldn't expect it to be like that, but it's an onshore environment in summer. So we get rain mainly in February and March, a bit in April, some in June. Then we have to wait till February and March again. It's a very dry winter, and it's surprisingly a cold winter. We don't grow much grass because the sun goes north in the winter, of course. So day length disappears pretty quickly and radiation disappears, and so photosynthesis slows right down. And even if you get rain, you can't grow much grass through winter. So against that background, the experiment of being a grazier in the Bega Valley, I would say it was pretty challenging, especially coming into the drought. I mean, the drought was a terrible thing for most people.
But it's not an unusual event for Australia. I mean, the first settlers, when they popped in and decided to set up camp, they went into one of the driest and hottest short-term periods, and it almost failed in regards to the ability to grow their own thing. They desperately had to send ships away to get more stores and that all the way to Cape Town.
No, well, Norfolk Island is where HMS Cirrus was pranged on the coral, and that went away simply to try to look for supplies for Sydney. Let me just get a graph up here, if you don't mind. This is that's not Bemboka. That's moving north. No, that might be Bemboka. Now, how do I do this?
Double click on the image you want to put up. You've selected screen share. Share screen.
Share screen.
Yeah. You should be able. Then you should be able to pick an image.
Right, you can see that. That's not the one I want you to see.
Yeah, it's come up now. We've got a graph of McAid, Springshaw. No, this is a different one.
No, that's
1900 to
hang on.
2000.
I'm getting myself lost. I want to show you some river data.
Okay. Okay. If you collapse that one,
I want to show you the
rain discharge.
No. Disappeared, has it?
Oh, I can only see rain discharge, Heron. There's down Rutherford Creek.
Yeah, Rutherford will do. No, Tandawangalo is the one I want to show you.
Okay, that's there on the bottom. You double click on that.
So, yes, so you can see that all right?
It's coming up now, yep.
Okay, that's
going from 1950 to 2020.
Yes, now that tells us about the droughts in the Bega Valley, and it's not much different to the situation in eastern Queensland either. So the black areas here, they're the droughts. The red areas are the particularly bad droughts, and this one here is the one that we ran into, the one that we ran into when we went to Bemboka. The difference is that these droughts in black were short and sweet. These droughts in red were more prolonged, but they were still short and sweet. They were due to lack of rainfall, obviously. And this one here from 2016 was again short and sweet, but this fella in the middle it was a drought because we got no recharging rain. Rainfall wasn't particularly low overall through that time, but there were no high rainfalls. And that's the other sort of drought that people experience.
So you basically get enough rain to get by, but not to replenish.
That's correct. And so the catchments don't replenish, so the streams stop running because there's no replenishment. And when you look at the rainfall records, you get all these little bits of rain all the way through, but you get no real rainfall when you need it, which is in February, March and April. A fair bit of this rain might come in June. And it's a bit like what happened in Queensland this year with a dry summer, generally a dry summer, and then the rain came along in April, which is sort of not seasonal for their conditions. But this drought here really was very wearing. And after it ended, the other thing about the climate on the south coast is we only get relatively short periods where my mouse is moving. We only get relatively short periods of adequate rainfall of generally reasonable conditions. It's either the periods of dry weather, the periods of drought are much longer than the periods of what you'd say were good conditions that lasted for several years. And I think that shied me off a bit. It cost us a fair bit of dough as well, but it shied me off a bit from the farming life. But it was also a difficult.
If you want to collapse that, Bill.
Sorry.
If you want to discontinue sharing that.
I'll stop share, will I?
That's it. Now
right,
we're back.
Okay. So there we are. We're back.
Well, that's interesting what you're saying there about the late rains and that, because that's exactly what we experienced in Cairns. We usually, the monsoons seem to be getting a little bit later, and you don't really count on them until the new year sort of thing. But we went through January to April, and we're about 400 to 600 mils under the average. And we didn't sort of pick up until April and get, a much higher than average. And we've been basically a little bit higher than average and sort of getting back close to where we are at this point in the time in the year. We are almost back to the average level. But that first 3 months, we were down considerably in rainfall.
Well, I happen to have a picture of the Barron River. Now that's Cairns, isn't it?
That's Cairns. Yep, that's our river.
There we are. So this is the Barron River at Mareeba.
Yeah, if you click share screen.
Whoops. Right, share screen, share.
Yep.
So you can see that. So
yeah, it's coming up. If you clicked onto there, here it is. Tinaroo Dam up the top.
Yep,
it's
that's right. That was built in 1958. And the data here starts in 1920, and it's for the river gauge at Mareeba. Now I've been doing a little bit of work on Queensland river flows for different things, but we haven't published anything on this yet. But what the graph shows is down the bottom in this B slot, it tells you about the main months of discharge, and of course they're in March and February, but mainly March, and we get these high or extreme discharge events, and then we get not much discharge at all and through until February. So there's really only 2 or 3 months of really good discharge measured at Mareeba. The important point about this is that about 10% of the rainfalls are responsible for over 75% of the discharge. So when you look at data like this, you realise that the incidence of discharge is very much related to rainfall, of course, but the magnitude of discharge is such that we get a few big discharge years, which makes the average high, and then many years with moderate to low discharge. And in the graph up top, these vertical bars, they represent actual measured discharge above this line, which is the 50th let me get this straight, that's the 75th percentile. This means that 75% of flows are less than 100 megalitres a month, or sorry, 100,000 megalitres a month. But then we have these big events in 1920, all the way through here, there's big events. And then when Tinaroo Dam got built in 1958, a lot of those little events all disappeared because the dam stored those little events and accumulated them. And the only ones we see after that are the really big ones. So the dam changed the nature of the flow from being every year getting visible flows, low down, we're low down the river at Mareeba, and it essentially saves all that and lengthens the amount of flow that you get through the whole year. But this, up here, we can see the level of variation, and it's a little bit it's a little bit biased after Tinaroo Dam went in, because it's picking up a decline that actually isn't real. The decline is due to the dam, not due to the climate. But it illustrates how basically the El Nino Southern Oscillation does this. It causes some years to be reasonably wet, and then some years to be reasonably dry, and it's exactly the same sort of problem that I was illustrating with Bega. Now I'll shut that one down.
We're back. In regards to soils and that, when you're with the Department of Natural Resources in New South Wales, did you limit, was your scope limited to public land, or were you also engaged in looking at private land, you know, and their productivity and soils as well?
We were looking at devising recommendations on how to improve the productivity of grazed lands across the Murray-Darling Basin without high inputs going into the system. In other words, without putting on high rates of fertiliser. We're working through things like grazing rates and grazing intensities and the effect of that on the soil. So we're measuring lots of parameters to do with soil carbon, soil fertility, and productivity of the pastures, and botanical composition, and a great range of things, as well as runoff and soil loss. I guess as a general statement, it's virtually impossible to increase grazing intensity, or to increase the production of grazing animals off pastures without reducing the carbon stocks in the soil. Those two things are interrelated. And if you have a low productivity pasture situation like we did at Wagga in our untreated catchment, as you start grazing it, you start turning over more nitrogen, more phosphorus, and so forth in the system, and then a lot of the material that would otherwise become soil carbon is actually exported through the animal, because you're harvesting that, or the animal's harvesting that and taking it off. And I have read a lot of the material about storing carbon in the landscape and so forth, and really that's essentially the trade-off. There's a trade-off between being able to extract productivity through animal grazing and indeed through cultivation and growing crops, and storing carbon in the landscape. Those two things are basically, well, you'd almost say contradictory, but they're actually opposite forces. So,
well, it's competition, isn't it? The animals, and even like us, we need carbon-based diet to ingest, and then we store it as flesh and all those sort of things. So if the cow's eating the grass, it's building its bulk from the carbon in the material and denying it to the landscape.
Yeah, essentially you're petitioning the amount of energy coming into the paddock by either sending it off by grazing animals, or keeping it there as stored carbon and feeding the white ants and the cockroaches and all the other things that get busy on the methane cycle, it's all very much interrelated, complicated but interrelated.
In regards to your experience with soils and that, in general, is a lot of Australian land marginal, or like you wouldn't say it's, there'd probably be pockets that you'd say are reasonably fertile and you could throw a seed in and something would grow, but then there's an awful lot of ground around that, gee whiz, it's hard getting something out of it. So as a general rule of thumb, what sort of percentages would you say is good land versus, gee, you have to work hard to get something out of that?
Oh, look, it depends on the rainfall, and at the end of the day, farm size reflects that. Where in fairly productive areas where the rainfall's reasonably good, farm sizes generally, that is unit farm sizes generally, smaller than the rangelands and Western Queensland and places like that. It's not possible to pull very much more productivity out of rangelands than's already being grazed out. I mean, without running big risks with the climate and without running into droughts and other problems. And soil erosion's been a major issue, of course, and few people realise that rainfall through, well, Queensland, Eastern New South Wales and Victoria was very low up to about 1950. 1947 was about the break in the drought in most places. And it was only after that we've seen real productivity gains, because the rainfall was the factor holding everything back. I mean, they often blamed land clearing for this sort of thing too, but basically the constraint was rainfall. I mean, you can clear the land, but if you don't get the rainfall to grow something, then it's not an economic proposition to clear the land.
The other thing is too, if in regards to the Murray-Darling Basin that you had an overview of as well, the addition of irrigation water, how much does that help in regards to soil quality, or is it just fact you've got water there and things can grow? Or is there also a add-on benefit that the soil gets better if it's damp or wet?
Well, obviously you add water, you can grow things, and if you can grow things that you can grow your local community, and the Snowy Mountains Hydro Authority in the Murray Valley anyway, and the Murrumbidgee Valley, the Snowy Mountains scheme allowed growth in places like Leeton and all the way along the river system that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So some of those towns were part of the Snowy Mountains scheme. And Leeton's a really pretty town, and there's towns along the Murray. There's towns along the Darling also that owe their future basically to the irrigation available out of the Darling River, which came out of Queensland and the high country in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland. And then of course the Murray and the Murrumbidgee all rise in the alpine areas, where rainfall's more plentiful than elsewhere.
I know those horrible things called dams that a lot of people seem to object to around the place, but when you think about it, like the Snowy system itself, what it did is turn the Murray into a controllable flow that provided water all year long, instead of a seasonal rush and gush until such time that flow stops and it becomes a drain, just becomes a drain, and you can't get much out of it. Whereas the dam system allows a fairly good flow all the time. In regards to, we've got a situation up in here, is this policy of wild rivers. In other words, don't even think about controlling them or making use of them. They've just got to run wild. So you can have them run wild during our wet season where they're a great big rush, and then for the next 9 months, they just peter out to nothing. Do you think that's a wise way to go, or do you think we should be looking at controlling rivers to sort of, keep the flow more regular and then also take advantage with it?
Look, I'm sure there's a sensible middle path. In New South Wales, up to about early 1980s or late 70s, we had the Irrigation Commission. They did valuable reports on all the New South Wales river systems. So each river had a major report done on it, and it was the basis of that allowed the planning and the planning of better land use along the rivers and the use of irrigation water. I'm not anti-dam, but I don't think everything should be dammed up either. So that's sort of an issue for communities, I guess, more than it is for an individual to say, oh, well, I don't think you should have them, or you should have them, or what. I'm not even up in Queensland, so.
No, well, actually, back in April or the beginning of the year, I had the mayor of Wyndham East, which is Kununurra, and a tour operator in the Ord area. And it was interesting, the fact that they now had a flow with that dam. They now have a flow system between two dams that is basically kept at a constant level. And from that, they've managed to create all these wetlands. And so you've got masses of birds, and then they're also got, you know, wildlife, and then they're also got a means of agriculture. So slowing it down to sort of that sort of pace gives them year-long benefits. I suppose that's what I'm talking about. The water is there, controlled all through the year to everyone's benefit, even nature's.
Oh, nature gets a big benefit out of it. I'm sure. You know, the dams that are full of water get a lot of wildlife in them too. But really, the development of these areas that receive most of their rain in just one part of the year depends very much on having that rain stored and released for future use. And these dams, the dams are designed probably on return periods of 10-year drought return periods, or 15 or 20 or something, which means that they're actually designed to empty. There's always going to be years that you don't get a full dam, but the dams themselves are designed to empty. And when you look at a dam that's emptying, and in the sort of environment we have, where we've got La Ninas coming along every 6 or 7 years, and El Ninos that last for a couple of years interspersed with that, then saving the water and releasing it later grows the communities.
Makes sense.
It just grows the communities.
Before we move on to bomb watch, I just want to touch on last thing about soils in regards to, in your experience in regards to productive land, and even if it's pastures and grasslands, have you seen a reasonable reduction of fertilizer use over the years? And is there a limit to how far we can reduce fertilizers? Because there is a push now to sort of try to limit fertilizer use. It's being tried over in other countries. So is there a sort of cut-off point where you probably couldn't go without at least some artificial or man-made fertilizer?
Look, most farmers would now be taking soil tests. Soil tests are widely used now to diagnose nutrient deficiency in soils, and most people on the land probably have an idea of what their soil nutrient status is. If you just simply graze and take off and graze and take off, you're exporting nutrients as well. So I'm not a fan of simply reducing the capital value, the nutrient value, nutrient capital of land without paying it back somehow. And it doesn't magically appear. So again, it just becomes an issue for a local person to decide what they want. There's areas that are highly productive. They deserve probably more fertilizer input than areas that are less productive. You wouldn't, you wouldn't throw too much fertiliser around a Bega Valley, but you'd have to throw some around, for example. That's on rangeland sort of country.
But the thing is, farmers, it's a cost, and it's like every business. You always try to minimise those costs. So it's. I mean, I come from West Australia, and I remember the old superphosphate bounty and that on the wheat fields, and that was a bit of a plague in regards to, people got money for how much superphosphate they threw around the place. But today, it's a completely different landscape, a different sort of regulatory environment, and so farmers would be naturally trying to reduce their costs, reduce their fertilizers, and also technology comes along and also helps with the types of fertilizers available, so you don't have to have this wide scattered spreading as we did in the past. So it's a lot more scientific. There's a lot more technology available for people to make sure they're using the minimum amount that they need.
Yeah, all that is true, but we don't want to go down the track and end up like Sri Lanka, do we? They've saved so much. They've saved so much money that they can't make any money.
Yeah, well, starvation sort of causes problems, doesn't it? Or the prospect of starvation causes problems. If we could just now move on to bomb watch, but what I want to start off in as we move into bomb watch is your paper on the 2019-2020 bushfires in your submission to the inquiry. I've read over it fairly quickly, then I've read some parts in a bit more detail. But one of the interesting things I noticed is there's the water bounce and the measuring of water flows at different times. It's a sort of reads like there's a diagnostic tool that probably most people could for themselves, with a bit of information given could evaluate on their own landscape what the potential problems coming around from dry years would be going forward by measuring this water bounce and flows of their local creeks and things like that.
Well, if we just talk about the New South Wales inquiry, the New South Wales inquiry started off being a New South Wales inquiry, and they got to a point where they decided they weren't going to have it anymore, and they handed it over to the Royal Commission. So the Royal Commission came along and took over just about where the New South Wales inquiry left off. I'm not even sure that there was a final report from the New South Wales inquiry, but the fires were particularly savage on the south coast, and the reason for that is the lack of hazard reduction. Now, I make no apology in saying that, and it applies everywhere. But the main reason for the terrible fires that we had on the south coast and the central coast and further north into southern Queensland was lack of hazard reduction in New South Wales. In the coast of New South Wales, the environmental requirements under the New South Wales Bushfire Act simply overwhelmed people's ability to undertake hazard reduction. And there were inquiries into it. There were legislative. There was a parliamentary inquiry into it, and they decided not to change the predominance of the Environmental Act. And so what actually happened was, if you tried to get fire reduction done, which I did in 2013, the local volunteer bushfire brigade people would have to do an environmental impact statement to undertake hazard reduction. And the fact that they didn't, the fact that they couldn't be bothered, you don't get volunteers for that sort of stuff. The fact that they didn't led to this catastrophe. It was really a catastrophe. The fires that went through to Tartha in 2018 should have been a warning bell for what was likely to happen, and they still didn't do anything. And still, by 2020, the bush was dry. There was a lot of bush. The fuel loads were high, and it only took a match, or it only took a lightning strike. It only took an ignition point, and the whole thing went up as it did. It came out of Victoria through Malakuta, up almost to Eden, and then we had other fires burning around Mimboka and further north. I had left the valley by then, thankfully, but in 2013, I ran a water balance for our farm, basically, so that I could predict, because the rainfall is so seasonal. I wanted a way to predict how long the grass would grow for on how much rain that we got in February and March. And so I ran just my little water balance tool. And it was pretty clear in 2013 that the drought had ended by then. And it was pretty clear in 2013 that the landscape was entering a drying phase. And there was no likelihood of a sudden change in that. If it did change, it wouldn't have mattered. But I was making a fair bit of noise through the local paper and the local authorities to try and get hazard reduction going. They wouldn't have a bar of it, and that's because of that's basically because of the Rural Fire Service hierarchy not allowing it to happen. And so when the Royal Commissions came along and the New South Wales Inquiry came along, I was astounded at the way that they blamed the climate, when in fact there was a lot more to it than that. And that's why we have the report on bomb watch under bushfires. So it's a fairly detailed report, and it's probably more than I can talk about here. But it was a great concern that, that the landscape was drying out, and they wouldn't do anything about it. Not the local. I'm not talking about the local blokes. I'm not talking about the local volunteer people. I'm talking about the hierarchy. The hierarchy wouldn't have a bar of hazard reduction at that time.
Just touching on that, it's quite ludicrous to have a environmental impact study to do prescribed burning. You would think the environmental requirements is to basically save your asset, whether it's a forest or property or whatever, and you put in some regulations that say, well, if we standards to do, if we're going to be able to save our forests and save the properties around them, we need this much prescribed burning, and it has to be buffer zones between where people live, like in communities, and the natural forest. And that you think it would be basically something that's promulgated in a standard, and not something that would be have to be thought up each year or evaluated or justified.
Yeah, I must admit I was pretty angry about the whole situation as it evolved, and I felt really sorry for people who were affected by it, people who lost their lives, for example, their properties, and I just felt they could have done a lot to reduce the hazard of the developing hazard. I mean, what happens is that the amount of accumulated fuel drives the intensity of the fire, but it doesn't affect the likelihood of a fire or the frequency of a fire. If they had adequate fuel reduction happening from 2013, then there simply would have been less stuff to burn, and they still would have had fires, but the fires would not have been. I don't believe the fires would have been nearly as severe as they turned out to be.
Well, if you haven't got the fuel load, you're not going to have the biggest fire. So that's the standard sort of forestry, you know. Any logger could tell you that.
So they know about that. They know about that. But it was just impossible to get them to move. And the other problem on the south coast, and it's probably similar other places, is that the window for hazard reduction is not very big. We can expect, when I lived there, we could expect rain in February, March, and maybe at a tail off in April. We had then from May basically to July, before the wind started in August, to do something about that hazard reduction window. So it's not a big window. It's not as though you can just go out and toss a match on a paddock. But but August is quite a windy month. And once you get wind behind dry grass and wind behind dry vegetation, you're in great trouble. So there were fires. There were early fires in 2015, maybe. Might have been 2018. Basically because the landscape was drying out, and then a fire started on windy days, and that just makes it impossible. But so the window's narrow, but people, the authorities I'm talking about, there needs to be something done locally about managing the risk, and that's been widely recognised. I'm telling you what I'm saying, what many inquiries have found, royal commissions all over the place. And there was a review done by the New South Wales Parliamentary Library Service, which pretty well summarises the state of knowledge, which I've referred to in that bushfire report. Totally ignored it was.
Well, that's one of the things that surprises me so much. I mean, I just, on that inquiry side for New South Wales anyway, there was over 900 submissions. When we had the Vegetation Management Act in Queensland and they had the consultations, we had there was well over 700. But most of the time, it's still the outcome is still something that's already basically predetermined by the people who are listening, if you know, to the inquiry. So that's a bit of a worry when you have so many inputs that actually get ignored.
Well, at the moment, through the rangelands of Western New South Wales and southwestern Queensland and further north, we have a woody weed invasion going on. And the woody weed invasion is to do with storing carbon in the landscape. And there's hardly been a whisper about this, but it's all to do with companies buying carbon credits, and those carbon credits going out to places like Winton and further, and people buy the ground just to simply walk away from it. This is going on right before our eyes, and there's never been an open inquiry into the consequences. The consequences of all this is going to be fantastic when it just can't.
When it blows up.
When it blows up, that's right.
Just moving along, I mean, two of the biggest contributors to the climate debate scenario in regards to everything's got to do with climate is our CSRO and then our BOM. Now, I actually went back in my emails, and it goes back to 2006 when I was sort of continually bombarded. Then, he actually was Minister of, in 2006, he was still a Minister of Environment, Greg Hunt. Then, of course, after 2007, they went out of power. But I continued to bombard him with information, because you could go onto the BOM records and look at the records going back to about 1910 and have a look at how things changed. And my general layman's sort of research of it is, a lot of these sites only had about 0.5 of a degrees change over since 2010, and then some of the sites, because you look at them and they were at airports and things like that. Well, you can imagine Kingsford Smith Airport in 1910, there wouldn't be much of a heat island effect, urban heat island effect. But now you would want to discount that as a site because of jet engines, the amount of concrete and all those sort of things. But they still get a Guernsey in the determination what the temperature is. And unfortunately, a lot of the rural sites that have a history and also haven't changed much since the time they were established, they're actually gone out there. They've been taken off the their stations have been discontinued. So with your bomb watch, how do you sort of look at each individual area and then sort of, well, also take into account the change of the local environment over that time?
Well, so far we've analysed 12 of Australia's what we call acorn sat weather stations. I can read you out a list, but I don't need to. Essentially, take an example like Cairns. Cairns, the original Cairns site was located right beside the runway, beside the building that was actually the air traffic control building or the air radio building. And it was started in 1939. And then they moved it, and there's files in the National Archives. I've got airport maps, I've got aerial photographs that show where all those sites went to, and show that. And it really comes down to the fact that the bureau forgot where the sites were, and they allowed site changes to appear in the data as being due to the climate, when in fact they were site moves and changes that created the problems. And similarly with Townsville, similarly with all over the place. So I do a lot of research. It might take a couple of months to do a bureau site, but I can't rely on the information they have. I have to rely on information from the National Archives, the National Library, local history societies, as much as I can grab hold of. And then I write this, and then I analyse the data and write a report about it.
I suppose the thing is there, at least when you're going back to that raw data, which I presume it is, at least it hasn't been homogenised and adjusted.
No, well, that's the process they use. They use this process called homogenisation, which is meant to account for those things. But the process itself cannot do that. When we look at from all the stations I've analysed, and there's more than the 12. Each one has other stations. Each analysis has other stations there. There's actually no change in Australia's temperature. The temperature is driven by rainfall. Rainfall is driven by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and so we've always been through periods of hot, dry weather and cool, moist weather, and hot, dry weather and cool, moist weather at varying times, and it's really more than clear that the methodology has biased the outcome in this case. So I mean, if people are interested, each one of our reports has what we call a front story, which is what you see when you go to the site and have a look at it. But at the bottom of each front story, there's a downloadable scientific report on that site. So nothing we say in the front story isn't backed up in the site story. And I'm working on more as we speak, and also some work on sea surface temperatures along the Great Barrier Reef. All these will eventually be placed up on Bomb Watch.
I'm a regular scanner of what's up with that website, and throughout its history, it did go through a phase there at showing a lot of the different sites, weather sites, measurement sites in the United States, and you've got, they've got categories, of course, what in regards to their effectiveness or whatever, but some of these primary stations, like, they're now in the middle of a car park, and cars can come up and park within a few meters of the Stevenson screen. And then you have other ones where in the same compound there's an incinerator where people burn obviously their rubbish, and other ones there's it's near a building that's got air conditioners on it, that obviously air conditioners keep you cool inside, but gee, they pump a lot of hot air out the back, sort of thing. So how many good quality weather stations do we have in Australia, do you think, that are sort of remain pretty well pristine to the original setup and location?
The several hundred that I've looked at, I've looked at about 600 altogether, but the several hundred I've looked at in detail, only Alice Springs has moved. Only only Tennant Creek is in the same place now as it was in 1937. In other words, I can see it on a 1937 map. I can see it on aerial photographs, and it's still in the same place, and it's still there now. But all the others have all moved and changed, and they've changed their Stevenson screen sizes, and they've changed from thermometers to automatic weather stations. All these changes combined give you a rise in temperature. So it's just not possible to take a bunch of data and toss a line on it and say, oh, look, the temperature's gone up or it's gone down, because in fact, it hasn't actually changed. If I say that really quietly, it hasn't changed.
Well, actually, I've read a bit of material in regards to the Stevenson screen, and it went through a few changes in regards to size. But one of the other things that when they were first made, they used to be whitewash. Now, eventually that changed because I presume whitewash went out of vogue and it became painted. But that actually made a difference, changing from a whitewash to a paint. And then when we went to electronic monitoring, instead of just reading the old mercury thermometer and all that, because of the reaction times of electronic temperature measurement is so quick. Like if you've got a quick rise in ambient heat because wind came or warm wind came of that, it would take the mercury a little time to react and get up. Whereas electronic, it reacts much quicker. So you're now getting, it would be presumable that you would be getting regular times when there was more heat than between one method and the other, or even lower temperatures because it reacts quicker.
The size of the screen has a lot to do with it, more to do with it than the instrument. I mean, a small 60-litre Stevenson screen, which replaced 230-litre boxes, which is quite a large Stevenson screen. The small screens pick up little zephyrs of air coming off the back of a car, or something coming across the runway, or hot air rising off a rock, or someone walking past. And I've actually been to a couple of weather stations where, over the years, where the Bureau people said, don't go too close to the Stevenson screen because you can affect the temperature inside it. Because the instruments are very sensitive, as you say, but also the screen size means they're not buffered against little blow-in bits of air, parcels of air that can be warmer than ambient. And the maximum temperature that's measured each day is a single value out of all the values that could have been. So it is actually the maximum for the day and the minimum for the day. And if you have a probe that's operating at a high frequency, you've probably taken thousands of readings, but only one of them's important, which is the max and the min, because the average temperature for the day is worked out as the difference between the max and the min divided by 2. That's all that these little boxes record.
So that's how smart they are. And what the trick is to get people to manipulate it and use computers to get more value out of it.
Look, this data is very coarse. It is affected by all sorts of things, including they spray out the lawn underneath the screens, they plough around the outside, and the things that you've talked about. I mean, Ken Stewart, who's a Queenslander, he runs a site called Ken's Kingdom, and he's been across most of Australia's weather stations, looking at satellite photographs and so forth, and given them an assessment. Now, he's done a pretty good job with his site, and it's worth a visit if you're interested in looking at that. The work I'm doing is different to Ken's. I'm looking at trying to find true trends in the data, true trends, true changes in frequency, changes in other characteristics to do with the data. I mean, that's been the focus of my work really on bomb watch. And then, of course, there've been the other things I've been doing is the bushfire inquiry. I've got a fair bit of information now on river flows, especially in Queensland, but a lot in New South Wales. There's a lot of data in the public domain, and getting that data and spending the time to actually work something out of it is a bit of a hassle. And I'm currently working on temperatures along the Great Barrier Reef. They have some in situ temperature sensors that have gone back for 30 years now of high frequency data. I mean, it's a bit messy, but there's no trend in sea surface temperature. And we also analyse sea levels at Cooktown and Port Alma at Rockhampton and Townsville. There's no change in sea level. The whole thing is just a dance, really. It's bizarre that science has got to the point where it has. That's leaving you a bit breathless, I can see.
No, I was just thinking, well, the thing is, there's so many people's livelihoods depends on the story. There's, if you look at all the Australian universities, they've got a climate change section with several professors of this and then researchers and all this sort of thing, and it just goes. So there's a big industry support. So it's self-perpetuating. But just getting back to the bomb, I don't quite understand the bomb's charter in regards to my view of what the bomb should be is to look at the weather, past trends, new trends, and give us a decent forecast for tomorrow, the next day, Wednesday. There are 3 days in advance. Give us a bit of, and they should be fairly accurate. Then get out to a 7-day forecast, and it can be a little bit off, but you've got a few days to get more relevant information. But I don't see its job to be banging on about climate change. Its job is to get us good weather forecasts. And I don't think there's a lot of people would put their faith in going out to sea, making a decision 3 or 4 days advance on the Bureau's weather predictions in a lot of cases. I wouldn't stake my life on it.
Some areas they do a very good job, but part of their charter is to advise the government about climate change. It's not to advise the government about no climate change, it's to advise the government about climate change. There's a subtle difference.
Don't invent it.
Sorry?
Don't invent it.
Well, there's not much evidence of it in most of Australia's climate data sets. If somebody wants to send me some, I'm quite happy to have a look at it, but there's really not much there. And as I say, we've done 12 sites, published 12 sites, quite a few in Queensland. We've found no trend. So if people are interested in a particular site, Charlieville's a really good one. I'd recommend looking at Charlieville.
The other thing that probably confuses me a bit is we've got the CSIRO as well, and that also sprouts a lot of climate sort of stuff, and it even has a section in that there. It's just that I probably don't feel the need to have both the BOM and CSIRO doing it. One or the other, and then maybe CSIRO could put some more bloody time into looking at things like getting better native grasses established and things like that, so we have a better environment actually on the ground. So it's both are in the same space, and I don't know if we need it.
Bill, they just play tennis. That's all they do. One produces the data, and the other hits it over the fence. They're actually quite an intermingled organisation, CSIRO and the Bureau, and various hubs under that. Everyone does as they're told, I think.
Well, we've gone over the hour, and it is Origin night, so we just wrap up here. Can you, when we post this up, we'll post all the links to Bomb Watch and that, so people can go onto the site. Is there anything in particular you want to wind up on and acknowledge the work of, say, others in the field, or or other things you got to move on to doing? Because I'm quite interested, maybe come back later on and talk about our big passion, and the thing we get bashed over the head with all the time is, the dead reef that we've got up here. So
no, you don't have a dead reef.
maybe that could be another point of discussion later on.
No, you don't have a dead reef. I think there's a lot of misinformation going on around the place, and my next project will be a project talking about peer review, because I did a paper that I submitted to a journal on temperatures along the Great Barrier Reef based on a data set I had from 1871, and of course they wouldn't publish it. So there are all these little problems in trying to be heard, and it's not the first time I haven't had papers published. I mean, I've published in the past. I have a publication record, but to publish anything about climate, it's really so closely guarded that they just simply won't allow it to be published.
You've got to be on the right side of the fence.
You've got to work out of a university. You've got there's all sorts of issues, but I have a paper that I'm going to release very soon on that particular issue, on the issue of peer review, and I'll let you know when that's up.
Just interesting point there in regards to temperature taking on the water, back in the 1870s and all that. I'm pretty sure there was a number of expeditions where, and all part of the ship's record was always to throw a bucket in the water and take it and pull it out and take a temperature measurement. And so most ships had logs that recorded what the temperature was and the location they took the water out of the ocean. So ships' logs would probably have a lot of information, but I presume they also sent that off to be compiled in specific areas.
Well, there's actually a stack of data around that I've come across that is available, and I have some of it, but digitizing that, sticking it in a database of some sort of data where there might be hourly observations per day or half-hourly observations per day, it's a lifetime's work. I've come across data from Burns Philp ships that used to sail between Sydney and New Caledonia, and Sydney and New Guinea, and they used to log engine room temperatures, but engine room temperature gauges are not calibrated gauges. So I mean, they flop around like crazy because the engine's making so much racket, but they still log the temperature of the inlet water, and that's a fairly approximate sort of measure, really. But there's actually oodles of this data around. The problem's really getting.
But even though that data is a little bit jumpy or whatever, it would still show a trend or no trend, or I mean, it would still be
analyzable. It's analyzable, and I have I did analyse another data set in 1876 data set between Sydney and Darwin. That was a high frequency data set, and it took ages to digitise it, put it into the computer. But it was engine room temperatures, but there was an offset between engine room temperatures and in situ seawater temperatures of something like 3 degrees, I think. 3 degrees C comes to mind. But I haven't done anything with that data. I've just digitised it. But the time will come.
Well, the other thing is, because climate change is creating such a big spend, like, you would think maybe it's worthwhile putting some of that spend into digitising all these old records so we can get a better picture, and it might save us from spending a lot of money we don't need to spend because it's just within natural variation. But anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, but the picture wouldn't be pretty.
No, not for what I'm saying. It would be pretty for the people who are making their money out of climate change. So if we can just wind up there, Bill, look, I really appreciate your time. I hope you can come back in a while with a new data set. And like I say, you might, because this show works out, you can have multiple guests on. You might want to come on with your partner in crime on Bomb Watch, or someone else in maybe even a different field to talk about things. But look, thanks very much for your time tonight. It's been greatly appreciated, and I hope you've enjoyed this experience.
Certainly an experience, Bill.
And you're learning a bit about Zoom. The thing is that's all good.
I haven't done this before.
So you can have Zoom meetings between your partners in crime and pass information that way as well.
And it's very ad hoc as well. So it's not a prepared, a whole lot of prepared stuff. It's just very ad hoc sort of talk, which is fine.
Well, it's a talk show, and as long as we get some good information across there and make people think, that's the main thing.
All right. Well,
I'll just wind up now.
No,
and just stay on the air, and I'll talk to you off air in a little bit. If you've enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page. Also, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, next week, we'll be having Peter Rutherford on. Now, he's from Southeast Timber, and he'll be talking about the timber industry, the impacts over the years of withdrawal from the native forests, and where the future of timber is going, and also, of course, what the retreat of the timber industry from our natural forests means for things like bushfires and conservation. So please join me again next week.
Thanks, Bill.